What's going on YouTube? Welcome back to my channel, and in today's video we're going to go over probably one of the most requested topics that I get asked about, which is mastering. So let's jump into Ableton and I'm going to show you exactly how to master your own tracks. Okay, so we're inside Ableton as per usual, and we're going to have a look at mastering. Now, mastering is kind of a hot topic that I always get asked about, and it's something that I usually just kind of brush under the carpet. Mainly because for people who are asking about how to master their own tracks are usually the same people that aren't in a position to master their own tracks. Now, what do I mean by that? The best example is kind of like polishing a turd, right? If you have a amazing high quality master on a really bad track, it's still a really bad track. But if you have a really good track and you get a really good master on it, it still makes it a good track and probably slightly improves it, but only by a small margin. So mastering is just a whole nother entity in itself. Just like mixing, like we've been over this topic many times on this channel, you kind of have producing, mixing, and mastering all in their own individual bubbles, but everyone kind of puts them in the same bubble, when really they require different processes. So that's kind of why I've stayed away from it, because yes, it's fairly easy if you understand the fundamentals, but you need to make sure you're making good music, and you need to make sure that you are getting good mix downs within your music. So if you aren't doing those two things, then you're in the right place, because I have plenty of production tutorials, and I also have a mixdown course on YouTube for free and a paid for more advanced mixdown course on my website. So you're in the right place. But we are going to go over different ways to master your tracks. So we're going to look at DJ masters. We're going to look at third-party plugin versions to enhance for quality, and stock versions. We're going to look at AI mastering, and then we're going to look at the most basic form, which is what I usually recommend for everyone, which is just limiting. So we've got this track in here. It's been mixed down to the best of my ability. I'm pretty happy with it, and it's in a position ready to master. Now, I've got the project open because I know most people are probably going to master in their projects. If you are running on a computer that is already fairly CPU high, by what I mean by that is if you're running quite a lot of plugins already within your project and you start trying to do some of the more advanced plugins and third-party plugins that we're going to look at, you're going to run into CPU problems on your master, so just do it in a new project. You can see in the top right-hand corner that I'm already running at 58%. Luckily, I have quite a good Mac, so it will hold up while we do this video. So before you even start mastering your track and playing around with some of the plugins that we're going to have a look at throughout this video, it's really important to understand the point of a master. Because a lot of people just think it's that icing on the cake, which it can be if you've got those fundamentals right, which I was just talking about. But really, a master is just adding some extra color, clarity, and especially volume into the mix. It's just going to sort of really round off a track and just give it that extra kind of punch. Now, at the same time, if you don't know what you're doing, which most people don't when it comes to mastering from my experience from all the tuition I've done, they actually end up making their tracks worse. So hopefully this video will help out. So we'll start with the third-party plugins, because everyone likes to see the third-party plugins, obviously. And this is kind of a typical chain that you're going to see carry across over to the normal plugins and also the AI mastering that we're going to have a look at as well. In this chain, we're looking at EQs, something to add a bit of color, compression, imaging. Those can kind of interlink and interchange if you want, then limiting, and then metering on the very end. Now, typically I actually work in reverse in my mastering chain. Does sound a bit weird, but let me explain. So we're going to put some volume into the mix with the limiter. One is going to perceive and just be able to get that volume up so we can hear exactly what's going on in the mix. And it's also going to help balance out the mix. If you think typically the loudest part of a track is the lows, so that's going to go into the limiter first, which is then going to get pushed down, which is then naturally going to kind of balance out the mids and the highs. If I started with my EQ and then boosted my mids and highs because I thought they were quiet because the mix is too quiet as it is, and I haven't done that limiting, I might have actually just boosted my mids and highs too much because of that limiter balancing the playing field. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to start by doing a bit of limiting. Now, I'm going to pause it here, and I want you to take a screenshot of this if you are using the FabFilter Pro L2. These are kind of the settings that you want to have a look at. You want the style to be in punchy. It's personal preference. I feel that's what you get best. You want the look ahead to be fairly quick, so the limiter is working as quickly as it can. The attack and the release to be almost practically down to 0, because we want it to just sort of let go and let all the transients sort of come through. And the channel links both down to 0 as well. You also want your oversampling to as max as you can get it. Now, if I put it on 32, my computer blows up, so I just have to run it on 16, especially within a project, but most of the time I can run it in 32 in a new empty project. And all we're just going to do is add a bit of volume into this and start the project to limit by 1 or 2 dB. Next, we can go on to the imager. So I use Ozone Imaging for this. And what I'm just going to do is I'm going to put it about 100, solo it. And what I'm looking for here is kind of that pure sub. Now, if you can't distinguish what that is just audibly, the best example is, imagine you're in a rave and you go onto the toilet and you can just hear the boom, 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 boom. That's all I'm looking for. I don't want to be able to hear the mid-range or the melody. I just want to hear that kind of raw sub. And I'm going to push that as pretty much as mono as possible. So we want that just going straight down the center. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the highs. The highs are much easier to find than splitting the mid bands. And that's all I'm really looking for in the highs, is just that very, very top end. Easiest thing to think about, as soon as you can start hearing a bit of a bite to the sound, like there, it's probably a bit too much. Probably just want it there, and it just feels very sort of spacious. Now, a lot of people will push the highs very, very wide. I actually find you get a much tighter mix and a tighter master from having the highs either neutral or even just sort of brought down a little bit, and then pushing the mid-highs further. We can then just split the mid-highs and the mids pretty much straight down the middle. And this is the band that I'm going to push quite wide. There we go. I'm happy with that stereo imaging. And much like I keep on referring to, if you haven't done a good job at stereo imaging within the mixdown stage, then the mastering isn't going to be able to fix a lot of the issues that were there previously. We can now go on to a bit of compression and a bit of color at the same time. So what I'm using to add the color is the Oxford Inflator. This is a really kind of magical plugin. I have no clue what's going on inside of here, but it really just adds a lot of analog warmth, character, and texture to the mix. I'll also add a bit of gain in there, which is fine because we still need to get that volume up within this mix and master. And then finally, what we can do is we can now bring down the threshold within this compressor, which has been pre-set up. So just have a look at the settings, pause the video, take a screenshot. Just to go over it, you want typical kind of ratio, 4:1. You want your attack all the way down, and same with the release, pretty much all the way down. Now, this is where I see most people going wrong with doing their masters themselves, and this is what actually just ruins the whole vibe of a track and the hard work they've done. Over compression on the master. You over compress on your master, you're just going to kill all the dynamics and even some of the groove within the track as well. So just be very, very cautious with the amount of compression you're doing. And then finally, we have the EQ, which is probably one of the important stages as well, especially if you're working with a track that doesn't have the best mix down. Again, this has been set up with a specific preset. So pause the video, take a screenshot, and know that you want it on clean. You want to swap the readings from 12 down to 3 so we can be more accurate with what we're doing. And you want the linear phase on, and then I've set it to medium, but you could set it higher as well if your CPU will allow it. From here, what we're going to do with the EQ is just tidy up the mix. See if we can add a bit of extra sort of flair to any of lacking frequencies, maybe tidy up a few resonances, and just generally just try and get a bit more character and life into it. So I'm going to start by rolling off the very, very low end. Some people will argue where to roll off. For me, anywhere between 20 and 30 Hertz is kind of a sweet spot. I can then just look at the mix itself and audibly listen to it as well as visually and decide where to boost and where to cut. We're kind of trying to aim for like a smiley face on the EQ here. So the lows kind of coming up, it dipping down a bit in the mids, and then sort of coming a bit more up in the high end. So this little bell curve here that I've just added is to try and add a bit more separation between that kick and the bass. You can hear anywhere kind of around that region is that crossover area between that sub and the bass, and they're kind of just clashing a little bit. So hoping this will add a bit more clarity. And then just boosting it in certain areas where I think necessary, and then cutting out some of the harsh frequencies as well with these ones here. You can see I'm using the dynamic lift quite a lot. I really like this feature within the FabFilter just because it adds a nice amount of air and it feels very natural within the mix. Now you can see as well, if I am giving it a boost, I'm being very, very subtle and giving it a very wide curve. Whereas if I'm taking away, I'm being very, very sharp and maybe taking more sort of frequencies or lowering that kind of bell point further. This just means I'm naturally kind of giving it a nice boost without sort of being too specific to make one frequency too loud. And this will just mean I'm being very, very precise with what I'm taking away. So I'm not actually taking too much frequencies away as well. So this is one of my favorite things to do within my own masters. And that is a kind of a high boost lift and making it dynamic. It really just adds a nice amount of air and sort of spacious feeling in that top end. And now the last thing to do for our masters is to check all the leveling. So I use this Paz Meters, which is a metering software. So obviously we have dB, which is a form of volume metering. We have LUFs, which is another common form of volume metering, and RMS. RMS and LUFs are Very, very similar. Some people prefer RMS, some people prefer LUFs. I typically will try and use RMS. It's just what I used when I did a course on mastering. But you could use whatever you want. And what I'm looking for here is a peak RMS of round about -8 to maybe about -9. It's a very loud master and it will compete with most other masters out there. So that just means cranking up the limiter until I get to that region. Now, you do have to be careful when it comes to limiting like this, because the louder you crank your masters, the more you are reducing the dynamics within the track. So you do have to be kind of cautious of that trade-off, where if you get it louder, you're probably taking away some of the dynamic movement, but if you have it quieter, you'll have more dynamics. So it's just kind of finding that nice sweet spot for your track. And from my experience as well, if you've got a good mix down, you can usually crank the limiter harder and get that loud master with the dynamics. But as soon as something's sort of off in the mix, whether it's a nasty frequency which you can't quite get to when working across the whole audio file, or maybe it's one element is too loud and that's just forcing the limiter to work a bit too hard, then sometimes it's worth hopping back into the project, fixing things, and then going again. So that's master technique number one. What we can have a look at now is probably what's going to be most applicable to most of you, which is the stock version of mixing and mastering. The stock version of the master chain that we've just kind of had a look at. So we have an EQ here that we can cut the low end off and boost the highs like we just have. We have our imaging one, which is nowhere near as accurate as the ozone one, but we can still put the bass in mono and then add width to the rest of the mix. We then have our compression, which is just a preset, which is perfectly set up for what we're looking to do. And we can just adjust the threshold so we just get this needle to start moving. And then we can limit until we get to the required volume. Now we're going to be looking at a metering software called Ulean, which is free, so I've included it in here. But this one is working in LUFs instead of RMS. Like I said, they're very similar, but the actual way they read volume is slightly different. One, I believe, reads the waveform as a whole, and one reads the kind of peak of a waveform. Not too sure. I'm sure some mastering nerd will talk about it in the comments below, but it's way above my knowledge. But what we're going to kind of look for is probably about a -10 to -11 LUFs, just because that will equate to about the same as a -8 RMS. So just to kind of prove my point, I can pull up this RMS. We're a tiny bit off. I could have cranked it a little bit higher, but you can see -9.3, so practically -10, -8.9. So very, very similar readings, and still just as good a result, but maybe we don't have that extra kind of color that some of the plugins on this chain that was adding. Next on our list, we have the AI mastering. Now, you can do this on websites, I believe. I think you've got LANDR, which has a website and a plugin. I think Lala do a mastering one as well, I believe. Or you can get something like Ozone 9, or I think it's on 11 or 12 now, I believe, which has a AI mastering software inside of it. Now, this is really useful if you have no clue what you're doing and everything I've just been over sounds way too complicated and too confusing for you. because you have a mastering assistant. You can literally click mastering assistant. You can click the intensity of the master. You can click if you wanted to use the modern settings or the vintage settings, and it will even let you load in a reference track of your choice. So I could go into my I could get a track which maybe is very similar in sort of a tone and the feeling. So maybe I could use this one. So there you go, you can see it's tried to do its own master. It's put an EQ on it, it's dropped the lows a little bit, boosted the sort of mids and the mid highs, and then removed some of the high end. Put a dynamic EQ in it, similar to what I was doing in the previous one, but on different points. And then it's put a maximizer, which is its limiter, on there as well to get the volume in there. So it's done quite a good job actually, sounds quite good. For me, my personal preference, it's a bit too much mid-range, not enough high-end. It just sounds a bit too kind of snappy for my liking. It still needs for imaging as well. And as from my experience, because this is what I used to use before I had any understanding of mastering, it's very, very temperamental. So if you have a bad mix down, you're going to get a bad master from using Ozone. If you have a good mix, sometimes you still get a bad master because it's just very, very temperamental. And then finally, that brings us on to the last one, which is the most simple form of mastering, which is just a limiter and a meter. So you could use the U-Lean that we were looking at previously, and then either a stock limiter or even an external third-party limiter to get that volume into your track. If you're good at mixing, which is what I always recommend doing first, this is by far just good enough if all of this feels a bit too much to do. There we go, I've got the volume in the track. Easy as that. Export, send to DJs, get support, put it on Instagram, bosh. Okay, and there we go. Thank you for watching that video. I hope it was useful. There's a lot of information in there, and like I said, mastering is a complete different ballgame to producing and even mixing. So please make sure you get the fundamentals right first before even trying to implement any of the techniques that we had a look at today. Anyways, I will see you again for the next video.